Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Job chapters 1 and 2, the beginning of a longer study of this book. Uh, Now, chapters 1 and 2 are, notice we've got them defined here as the historical prologue, and we're going to see Job tested his story. And that's going to be written in typical prose. When we get to the end of the book, spoiler alert, chapter 42, we're going to have what we can call a historical epilogue where God's going to enter the picture and Job's going to be restored and everything will be good at the end. But notice most of the book is going to be what we call the dialogue and discourse section. And that section is going to be poetry. So we have, we could almost call these bookends in chapters 1 and 2, the first half, chapter 42 at the very end, but in the middle is going to be the poetry. But we're not going to get to that in this session. We're going to look right now just at chapters 1 and 2 to get the setting for the poem. Job chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Now, we don't even know what the name Job means. It's not a typical Israelite name. And we're not told that he was from Israel. He's in the land of Uz. Notice we're going to see that he's blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. But notice that land of Uz, that's not the land of Israel. That's not one of the tribes. As far as we can tell, this is located outside the land, commonly thought to be sort of to the southeast of the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. Now, when does the story take place? Well, we don't know. We're not told. We're not given enough to really pinpoint it. Uh, Obviously, it had to be written at a later date in order to tell the story from an earlier time. You don't tell the story while it's still taking place. You wait until it's finished and then you tell the story. And it could have been written much, much later. There seem to be some indications written at a time when Chaldean expressions were being used. There seemed to be some loanwords from the Chaldean culture, and they didn't move into southern Mesopotamia until, well, around 1000 BC. Now, I'm not saying that it was written then or later. I simply don't know. But took place at an earlier date. Israel's not going to be mentioned at all anywhere in the entire book. So here's this man. He's in the land of Uz. His name is Job. And notice how he's described. That man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. So those four descriptions, blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil, we're going to actually see God describing Job in exactly those terms. We're going to get used to that phrasing. Verse 2, 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep. Uh, I hadn't noticed until I was just reading this. Notice 7 sons, and corresponding to that 7,000 sheep. Uh, 3 daughters, 3,000 camels, and I'm not saying anything about his daughters there. It's just interesting that the numbers. And then 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, when you talk about the East, you say, well, what we looked at on the map isn't really east of Israel or Canaan, but that was considered areas to the east as well. So that still could have fit in. But notice it doesn't say he was greater than all the men of Israel or of Canaan. Those places aren't even mentioned in our story. Verse 4, his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. You say, well, what's his day? I don't know, maybe it was his birthday or maybe a special day or something. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them. Notice he's acting as priest for his family. He would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. So 7 sons, 3 daughters, 10. And that's a great number. Think about the 10 Commandments, or I don't want to necessarily think about the 10 plagues, although we're going to mention them in just a bit. But 10 burnt offerings according to the number of them all. I'm assuming that's what the offering, the according to the number of them, referred to. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. They weren't doing it on the outside, but maybe they didn't have the right thinking, And so he's covering for them as a proper priest should. And notice this was his habit. Thus Job did continually. Verse 6, now the scene changes. There was a day when the sons of God, and that phrase, the sons of God, notice, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan. Now, when it says Satan, actually the Hebrew says ha-Satan. You say, what's the ha part? That's the word the Satan. That's the definite article. And whenever I started to say whenever, most of the times, there might be one or two exceptions to this, but usually when you see Satan mentioned in the Old Testament, it's almost always the Satan. And of course, the word Satan means the enemy or the accuser. I think I like to go with enemy. So he would say the enemy also came among them. There's actually a few places where it refers to somebody who's an enemy that's not referring to the one we know as Satan, but here I think it is. So the Satan came, the enemy came among them. Now we're going to see, what's he been up to. It's rather interesting how he's introduced, and there's no description of who he is. The reader is almost expected to know. And so the sons of God, now who are the sons of God? I think perhaps, especially when we get to chapter 38, we're going to see a reference to the sons of God that shouted for glory at the time of creation. I think perhaps this is a reference to angelic creatures or these powerful spiritual hosts. But again, they're not given any great introduction. It's just, they're mentioned as part of the background, and we're not really going to talk about them because the passage doesn't. But Satan came also among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." So now that sounds like maybe they're not on the earth. I don't want to say that's for sure because we're not told. But he's been walking around, he's been traveling, and now he comes into the manifested presence of God, wherever this is said to be taking place. We're not told. Verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, remember it's the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there was no one like him on the earth." And notice the description, the same thing that we saw earlier, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. So as he had been described and when we first saw Job, so the Lord himself, and notice the Lord, it's his name. When you see the word Lord in all capital letters, that's the translators telling you that that's the name of God, Yahweh. So we have God named. Satan, we're seeing him by his title. And it's the Lord who says that Job is blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. So I don't have to think of that description as just what people said, but God himself says that about Job. Now, I'm not saying Job was perfect in every sense, but that overall he's blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. He was what we would call a good man. He was what God calls a good man. Verse 9, then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him?" Now, the idea of a hedge, you could have, it could be plant-based, it could be other ways to do it, but sort of a wall of protection. Notice a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side. God has protected Job. And Satan says, that's why Job, is being good, is because you've protected him. You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. Job is only being good because of the blessings of God, according to Satan. That's the accusation that Satan is making. And so, verse 12, then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand." Now, notice how it mentioned the hand and then the power. That's actually the same word there. Yadaka is your hand, the hand of you. Yad is the word for hand, and then the ka part is your hand. So notice he says, he's in your hand, only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. My friend Scott Hawk, in looking at this passage, he remarked, "This is a little bit like that movie with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. I think, yeah, Dan Aykroyd, Trading Places, where there's a story there that there's this fairly well-to-do fellow, and these two rich guys form a bet between each other that they can change the outlook of both a poor person and a rich person, and unbeknownst to those two people, they enter into this wager. And it's almost a little bit like that. Of course, that's just a very surface look. And let me just say, I think we're only given a very surface look at the story. We're not told all of God's reasons, and Job is not told all of God's reasons. That's going to come out as we read this book. Um, but it's interesting how this begins, how this is introduced. That it's something that Job is completely unaware of, and Satan and the Lord enter into this. Can I call it an agreement, where the Lord says to Satan, "Go ahead," but notice Satan is only given so much power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. You can touch what he has. You can't touch what he is. You can't touch him. And so Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. And in the ensuing verses, disaster hits. Chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, Job is out there and he gets news from a surviving servant who comes in. The Sabaeans, this desert tribe, has come and attacked and taken your oxen, your donkeys, while that person is still talking. Verse 16, a second servant comes. Fire has just come down from heaven, from the sky, and burned up the sheep and the servants. And while he's still talking, another servant runs up. The Chaldeans have come. Notice the Chaldeans, as we said, you don't really see Chaldeans, at least in southern Mesopotamia, until around 1000 BC. Now, that could describe the people that were there before the Chaldeans, so I don't want to say it couldn't have taken place until then. I don't really know. But the Chaldeans came and took your camels. Camels were actually not all that commonplace before 1000, at least in Mesopotamia and in the Middle East. They were not unknown, but they weren't all that commonplace. But Chaldeans took your camels, and Job's not going to have any for a while now. And then finally, a fourth messenger comes giving this terrible news that wind has caused the house to collapse on his sons and on his daughters. And now, was this one of those special days? Was it a birthday? Was it some sort of special time? But he has lost his possessions, and notice the escalation of these things. Ultimately, he has lost his sons and daughters. Verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. These are things that you would do in times of great mourning, of great disaster. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I can't help but think of that nakedness. It reminds me a little bit of how mankind was created. There's maybe an echo from the early pages of Genesis, but he's not talking about how he was created. He said, look, I came into this world with nothing, and I'm going to go out ultimately with nothing. You can't take any of your wealth, your family, you can't take any of it with you. Somebody said you can send it on ahead, but when you die taking nothing with you. Somebody said there are no U-Hauls behind a hearse. You can't take your possessions with you. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Verse 22, summary. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he, and my translation says, nor did he blame God. If I wanted to be really literal, I'd say, nor did he give badness toward God. I think that works. But we'll go, nor did he blame God. And now we come to chapter 2. And chapter 2 is going to be a repetition, at least to a certain degree, of what we saw in chapter 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, and this is almost like what we read in the first chapter, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." So far, it's the same story. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" That's what he said back in chapter 1. "For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God, turning away from evil." That's the same description. "And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Now, just in case there was maybe at the back of somebody's mind thinking, well, Job, yes, he was a good man, but maybe there were some other reasons. Actually, the Lord says that he was ruined without cause. Now, I'm not saying God didn't have any reasons, but there were no reasons of badness on Job's part. There was nothing wrong that he had done that brought this about. Sometimes, can I say it this way? Sometimes bad things happen not because you've done something wrong. You can do things right, and still bad things can happen. And Job is a case in point. Verse 4, Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh," that is his physical body, "he will curse you to your face." So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he's in your power, only spare his life." God gives Satan, even more ability to go and act against Job, but he cannot kill him. So again, Satan is given power, but again, it is limited power, limited by what God says. God is the one in charge. God is the one, can I say it this way? He is the one pulling the strings. He's not afflicting Job personally, but he's allowing Satan to do it. He's allowing the Satan, so almost like not quite a free rein, but quite a bit, as he will allow him to inflict pain and suffering upon Job. And so we read in verse 7, "Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils." Now, the Hebrew here, bishkan ra. Ra is the Hebrew word for bad or evil or like a calamity. But the term for boils there, bishkan, the bit is in with or in. So shakan is the Hebrew word there for a boil. And that's the same word that was used back in Exodus to describe the boils that were part of the plagues of Egypt. But these are bad boils. These can, maybe the hint is that you remember the plagues, but this is even worse. With bad boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, from one end to the other, and he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. The ashes are for mourning, but he's not just mourning over his loss, but now added to that is just the itching and the intolerable feeling of that was just terrible to feel, but we're going to see in just a minute, also terrible to behold. Verse 9, "Then his wife said to him," now his wife had not been injured in any of the earlier tragedies, and she said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." It's almost as though I don't want to say that she's speaking with the voice of Satan, but she's saying the very things that Satan wanted to be heard. Now, is he in this? I don't know. We're not told that. And Job's not going to say that that's the case. Although, verse 10, he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks." Somebody sort of humorously pointed out he doesn't call his wife foolish, but he says, "You speak as one of those foolish women speak." I've heard foolish women, and you're starting to sound like them. "Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, we don't know what's going on the inside, but he does, as far as what he says, there's no sin, there's no wrongdoing there. Verse 11, now when Job's three friends heard of all of this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place, and now we're introduced to them. We're going to see them quite extensively in the poetry section of the book. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. Verse 12, when they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him. Notice they see him and not as they first approach, and they look and we're looking for Job. and they look at him and he looks so very different because he's going through such a difficult, they've never seen anything like him. They raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. They are both mourning with Job, but they are also mourning for him. And in this description, as they see him and this lack of recognition, it reminds us of a prophecy that's given about the future Messiah, about Jesus. Just as many were astonished at you, and notice my people that's actually added by the translators, but it's you plural. So his appearance, notice that's singular, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And then it goes on to describe in the next chapter elements of the crucifixion, of the suffering and the death of the Messiah. And that maybe gives us a hint that when we look at Job, we see a picture, one who suffered, I would say in a sense like, but suffered greatly in the place of Job, and that's the person of Jesus. We're going to see this as we look at the next verse. Verse 13, then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days. Now, 7 days, that sort of takes me back to creation. And Job's story is one of decreation, where everything that he's had and it was good, he has been losing all the way down to his own sons and daughters. And so they sit there for 7 days and 7 nights with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. And as we see that, 7 days, 7 nights, like I said, it reminds us a little bit of creation, although this is going in the other direction. But it also reminds us again, it reminds us of Jesus who suffered on our behalf. And so the book of Hebrews talks about how we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Here we see the picture of Job suffering without sin, without saying anything wrong. And of course, we have the one who was greater than Job, also suffered, but he suffered for us. He suffered on our behalf, the suffering that we deserve, and so that he has experienced. He's been there with us. Notice Job's friends, they sit there for 7 days and 7 nights, no one speaking. They're suffering vicariously, but they're not actually going through the suffering. But Jesus went through our suffering. He suffered on the cross on our behalf. He walked our dirty streets and then died upon our dirty cross for us so that we might be accepted by God.